Imagine this. The year is 1943. Above the burning fields of Europe, American bombers thunder across the sky, their engines shaking the very earth below. But 2 decades earlier, in the trenches of France, another generation of soldiers gazed upward, watching the fragile wooden wings of British biplanes duel in the dawn mist. 2 wars, 2 eras, 2 nations separated not just by time, but by the very evolution of air combat itself. World War I Britain, masters of invention, pioneers of dogfighting, the first to write the rules of aerial warfare. World War II America, industrial giants, flooding the skies with fleets so massive they could darken the sun. But here's the question. Which truly dominated the skies? Was it the daring British aces of the Great War, carving history with courage and canvas wings? Or was it the unstoppable American war machine of World War II, rewriting the art of destruction with steel and fire? Today, we dive into this clash across time, Britain's fragile beginnings versus America's overwhelming might. Stay with us, because the answer may not be as simple as you think. And by the end, you'll see the skies of war in a way you never imagined. The story of air power begins not with roaring engines and endless bomber formations, but with fragile wooden frames stitched together with canvas, lifted into the skies by little more than wind and daring. The First World War was humanity's first great experiment in aerial combat, and Britain stood at the very forefront of this transformation. When the guns of August 1914 erupted across Europe, the airplane was still a novelty, a dangerous contraption more suited to county fairs than battlefields. Yet within just a year, the Royal Flying Corps would turn it into a weapon that could decide the fate of armies. Picture the scene. Muddy trenches stretched endlessly across France, soldiers pinned down under relentless artillery. Above them, British reconnaissance planes drifted across the horizon, cameras clicking, relaying vital intelligence back to generals. At first, the Germans hardly took them seriously. But soon bullets were mounted, pilots carried pistols, and the age of the dogfight was born. For the first time in human history, the battlefield had a third dimension. It was Britain's daring aviators who shaped this new art. Men like Albert Ball, Edward McManus, and James McCudden became household names, their duels against the fearsome Red Baron etched into legend. Their machines were flimsy, their survival rates horrifyingly low, but their courage made them heroes. To soldiers in the mud below, these aces were gods of the sky, soaring free above the slaughter. But Britain's air power in World War I was not just about romantic duels. It was about innovation. Britain pioneered early bombing raids with planes like the Handley Page, massive lumbering beasts that crept over German lines to drop their crude payloads. They built the first true strategy of combined arms, using aircraft to direct artillery, strafe enemy trenches, and blind German reconnaissance balloons. Still, the skies of World War I were intimate, personal, almost medieval. One man against another, guns chattering, the loser spiraling in flames. When Britain ruled those skies, it was through bravery and ingenuity more than numbers. The technology was fragile, the tactics experimental, the outcome uncertain. And when the war ended in 1918, the Royal Air Force, just born from the union of the Royal Flying Corps and Royal Naval Air Service, stood as the world's first independent air force. Britain had carved the blueprint of aerial warfare, but fast forward just 20 years, and the skies were transformed. By the time America entered World War II, the airplane was no longer fragile wood and fabric. It was steel, aluminum, turbocharged engines, and industrial might. And here, the United States of America brought something Britain never could: scale. When America unleashed its air power, it did so like a tidal wave. Imagine the skies above Europe in 1943 formations of B-17 flying fortresses, hundreds of them, stretching as far as the eye could see. Each bristled with guns, each carried enough bombs to reduce cities to rubble. Where British aviators once fought in intimate duels, American crews now fought in coordinated armadas. The philosophy had shifted. For the Americans, air power was not about the lone hero, but about overwhelming force. The daylight bombing campaign against Nazi Germany was a gamble, but it showcased America's determination to dominate the skies through precision and persistence. Squadrons of bombers pounded industrial targets, while long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang escorted them deep into enemy territory. But was this dominance truly greater than Britain's earlier mastery? Britain's airmen fought at a time when nothing was certain, when the very idea of aerial combat was experimental. Their courage carved the first legends of the sky. America, on the other hand, harnessed the full weight of an industrial superpower, achieving a kind of dominance the world had never seen. And yet, even America's might had limits. Their bombers suffered catastrophic losses in early missions, their strategy questioned, their skies contested by the deadly Luftwaffe. Britain, too, knew the cost of air supremacy. Its cities burned under the Blitz. Its pilots fought for survival during the Battle of Britain. Both nations learned that controlling the sky came not just from technology or numbers, but from sacrifice. So which truly dominated? The answer depends on what you see as dominance. Is it the courage to invent a new form of war when nothing existed before? Or the ability to unleash such overwhelming firepower that no enemy could stand against it? As we continue this journey, we'll step deeper into the skies of war. In the next part, we'll compare the human stories, the lives of the pilots themselves. Because behind every plane, whether a fragile biplane in 1916 or a roaring Mustang in 1944, there was a young man staring death in the face. And in their eyes, we find the true measure of dominance in the sky. What did it really feel like? To sit inside those machines, strapped in, staring into the void of the unknown sky? Was it the trembling fear of a British pilot in 1916, lifting his fragile biplane into the mist of dawn, knowing one bullet could tear the canvas and send him spiraling to his death? Or was it the pounding adrenaline of an American crewman in 1944, locked inside the steel belly of a flying fortress, surrounded by gunfire and flak, counting the minutes until they could escape the hell of German skies? The answer lies not in statistics or technology, but in the men themselves. Because the skies of war are not only fought with engines and bombs, but with nerves, hearts, and courage, pushed to the breaking point. In the First World War, the British airmen were called the Knights of the Sky. But unlike the romantic image of jousting knights, these men were barely trained, often sent into combat with only a handful of hours in the air. The life expectancy of a new pilot? Sometimes just 2 weeks. Imagine the sickening silence after briefing, when young recruits realized they were about to fly into almost certain death. The Royal Flying Corps became known among soldiers as the Suicide Club, and yet they volunteered again and again. For these British flyers, every mission was a gamble. Engines failed without warning. Guns jammed. Planes caught fire and offered no parachutes for escape. If you were hit, you either burned alive or jumped. That was the choice. And still they fought. Albert Ball, Britain's most celebrated ace, would dive recklessly into enemy formations alone, relying on sheer nerve and intuition. Mick Mannock, blind in one eye, flew mission after mission, racking up victories while haunted by the deaths of his comrades. Each man carried the unbearable weight of survival guilt, knowing tomorrow it could be his turn. Now shift the lens forward to the Second World War. The American sky warriors lived a different nightmare. They were not alone in single fragile machines, but crammed together in crews of 10, inside the bomb bays of monstrous B-17s and B-24s. Their lives depended not only on their own skill, But on every man around them pilots, navigators, gunners, radio operators, all trapped inside the same flying coffin. Theirs was not the silence of the lonely sky, but the thunder of engines, the rattle of machine guns, and the shriek of flak tearing through metal. They flew in vast formations, hundreds of bombers at a time, but for each man the world shrank to the icy cockpit, the frozen turret, the sweat-drenched gun sight. Missions lasted hours. At 20,000 feet, oxygen froze in the lines. Frostbite gnawed at fingers, and a moment's lapse could mean blacking out, never to wake again. And yet, like the British pilots of the Great War, they endured. The courage of the American crews lay not in dueling one-on-one with enemy fighters, but in climbing back into their bombers again and again, despite the staggering losses. On missions deep into Germany in 1943, as many as half of the planes never returned. Entire squadrons vanished in fire. Still, the men lined up, strapped in, and lifted into the skies. They believed that if they could break the enemy from above, the war could be shortened, perhaps even won. But here lies the haunting question. Who bore the heavier burden? Was it the British ace, alone in his fragile kite, facing death every morning with no escape but luck and skill? Or was it the American bomber crew, bound together in steel, knowing each mission might be their last as waves of Messerschmitts tore through their ranks? Both faced terror, but of different kinds. The British fought in duels personal, intimate, their victories measured in single kills. The Americans fought in endurance wave after wave, battles of attrition, their victories measured in the tonnage of bombs dropped and the destruction of factories and cities. One was a test of individual nerve, the other a test of collective resilience. And still, the human stories cut deeper than strategy or numbers. There were letters written the night before missions, sealed and left behind in lockers, never meant to be read unless the writer did not return. There were friendships forged in the air and shattered in an instant, when one plane burst into flames, spiraling earthward, leaving survivors staring in helpless silence. There were moments of awe of pilots watching the sunrise from above the clouds, knowing they might never see another dot, both the British in World War I and the Americans in World War II carried the same truth. The sky was both freedom and prison. Above the mud and blood, there was beauty, but also terror. Every mission meant facing a death few could imagine. So, who dominated the skies more? The answer depends not only on technology or power, but on the measure of human endurance. And endurance, as we'll see, is not only about the men who flew, but also about the nations that sent them. Because behind every pilot was a government, a factory, a nation willing to sacrifice resources and lives to hold command of the air. And in our next chapter, we will leave the cockpits for a moment and look at the engines of war behind them. The factories, the strategies, the governments that fueled the skies. For in the end, dominance was not just about who fought, but about who could keep fighting longest. Would you like me to continue into the next section, where I shift the focus from the individual pilots to the industrial and strategic machines behind? British World War I and American World War II air power? What truly wins a war, the courage of men in the skies, or the factories pounding out the machines that carry them? Is it the single heroic ace diving through clouds, or the endless convoys of bombers born from assembly lines that never sleep? Behind every duel in the air, behind every raid on a city, there was an invisible war fought in steel, sweat, and industry. And this war, too, tells us who really dominated the skies. In the First World War, Britain was fighting on the edge of invention. Their aircraft factories were little more than workshops, filled with carpenters and mechanics repurposed from civilian trades. Wooden frames were bent and nailed by hand, fabric stretched across fragile skeletons, engines bolted together in dimly lit halls. Each plane was a handcrafted gamble, Breakdowns were common, parts scarce, and performance unreliable. Yet Britain's ingenuity turned these fragile creations into tools of strategy. They built faster fighters, sturdier bombers, and perfected designs under the relentless pressure of combat. But Britain's strength lay not in numbers, it lay in adaptation. Every setback spurred a new design. Every German innovation forced a counter. The Sopwith Camel, with its tricky handling, became a lethal predator in the hands of skilled pilots. The Handley Page bombers carried war deeper than ever before, proving that planes could strike at cities hundreds of miles away. Britain's factories were not massive, but they were inventive, able to pivot, to innovate, to feed the Royal Flying Corps with just enough machines to hold the line. Now leap forward 2 decades into the vast hangars of America. Here the story changes completely. The United States did not just build planes, it built them by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, in a tidal wave of production, unmatched in human history. The American automobile industry, masters of assembly line efficiency, turned its attention to war. Where Britain once stitched fabric by hand, America stamped aluminum, riveted steel, and churned out planes with mechanical precision. Factories like those of Boeing, Douglas, and Consolidated roared day and night. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress rolled off the lines in waves, each one bristling with guns and ready to carry its load of destruction across the Atlantic. The B-24 Liberator was produced at such scale that Ford's Willow Run plant completed 1 bomber every hour. Imagine that a plane, larger than most houses, or not in months, but in minutes. This was dominance not just of the skies, but of economics, of industry, of sheer capacity to overwhelm. For America, the war was not fought with scraps and scarcity. It was fought with abundance. By 1944, American skies swarmed with machines so numerous that losses in battle, while tragic, did not cripple the war effort. Where Britain's pilots once feared they might run out of replacements, America's crews knew that behind them, endless factories were already birthing new wings of war. But production alone does not decide the battle. Strategy breathes life into machines, and here again the 2 wars diverge. In World War I, Britain used planes as extensions of the Army reconnaissance, artillery spotting, limited bombing. The skies were a support arena, a way to tilt the balance on the ground. Air power was vital, but it was still tethered to the mud of the trenches. In World War II, America unleashed a new philosophy, strategic bombing. Planes no longer served just the soldiers below. They became a weapon of their own, independent, designed to cripple nations from above. Factories, railways, oil refineries, these became the targets. The skies were no longer just about protecting armies, but about breaking the enemy's ability to fight at all. It was a cold, brutal logic. If you could destroy the enemy's industry, you could destroy their war machine. If you could burn their cities, you could shatter their will. American bombers turned this philosophy into firestorms across Germany and eventually Japan. Where British bombers of the First World War dropped small loads with crude accuracy, American bombers of the Second World War released torrents of destruction, guided by advanced sights and formations. The scale was staggering. Yet here lies a contradiction. Britain in World War I showed the birth of strategy, the first hints of what planes could do beyond the battlefield. America in World War II carried that idea to terrifying maturity. Britain's strength was in creativity, in proving that flight itself could be war. America's strength was in execution, in proving that war could be won from the skies alone. And yet, dominance has a price. Britain paid in lives and uncertainty, its airmen flying machines that could betray them at any moment. America paid in devastation wrought upon civilians, in the moral weight of cities reduced to ash. Both nations discovered that mastery of the skies was not only about victory, It was about consequences. So which was greater? Britain, fragile but inventive, seizing the future with fragile wings? Or America, relentless and overwhelming, transforming the future into a machine of destruction? Perhaps the truest measure lies in what each left behind. Britain left the legacy of invention, the very foundations of air power. America left the legacy of supremacy, the terrifying demonstration that skies could decide the fate of nations. But the question remains, what was the cost to those below? To the soldiers who looked up, to the civilians who watched their cities burn, to the millions whose lives were shaped by the shadow of wings above them? For that is the next chapter of our story, because to truly answer who dominated the skies, we must descend from the heavens and ask, how did it feel, not to fly, but to be beneath? What was it like, not to fly the planes, but to hear them above you? To look up and see the silhouettes of wings cutting across the sky, some fragile, some monstrous, knowing that death could fall at any moment. Was it awe? Was it terror? Or was it something in between? To understand who truly dominated the skies, we must not only follow the pilots who soared, but also the millions who lived, and sometimes died. Beneath their shadows. In the First World War, the arrival of an aircraft overhead was still a novelty. Soldiers in the trenches craned their necks, pointing upward as British or German biplanes droned across the clouds. At first, there was curiosity, even excitement. This new weapon seemed like a glimpse of the future. But soon the reality set in. The biplanes carried cameras, then bombs, then machine guns. They were not just scouts, but predators. Soldiers huddled in their trenches as British fighters strafed German lines, or as German planes swept down to rake the mud with bullets. The war below was already hellish, but now it had acquired wings. For the civilians of northern France and Belgium, the sight was even more haunting. Britain's early bombers, lumbering giants of wood and fabric, carried their crude payloads across borders. The first air raids in history terrified towns unprepared for this new form of war. Imagine standing in your village square in 1917 and hearing the buzz of engines above, not knowing if those fragile wings carried men who were lost, or bombs that could erase your home. For the first time, war was no longer confined to the trenches. The front line had moved into the sky, and it could reach anyone. Yet, compared to what would follow, these raids are almost whispers of what was to come. When the Second World War arrived, America brought thunder. No longer did civilians merely look up at a handful of biplanes. They looked up at armadas. Whole cities could vanish in a single raid. The experience of civilians beneath those skies was not curiosity. It was horror. In Germany, in Italy, across occupied Europe, families learned to dread the drone of engines in the night. Sirens wailed. Children were pulled from their beds and rushed into basements or bunkers. Mothers clutched babies. Fathers tried to remain calm as the ground shook and the sky itself seemed to split open. American bombers dropped not small, scattered explosives, but vast carpets of destruction. Factories, railroads, bridges, and yes, neighborhoods all were reduced to rubble. Civilians lived under a constant sky of fear, never knowing if the next raid would bring survival or silence. The difference between Britain's war in the air and America's was not just in scale, but in perception. For British soldiers in 1916, a plane overhead was still a duel of nights, a strange extension of the battlefield. For civilians, the destruction was limited, shocking, but not apocalyptic. For those beneath America's skies in 1943 and 1944, however, the war had grown into something industrial, relentless, mechanical. The sky itself became an enemy, and yet not all who looked up saw only terror. For occupied peoples under German rule, the sight of American bombers brought something else: hope. They knew the war was being carried into the heart of the enemy. They believed that each raid brought them closer to liberation, no matter the cost. For them, the thunder above was not just destruction. It was a promise. Still, the cost to human life was staggering. In Britain's Great War, the death toll from aerial bombardment was in the thousands anew. Horrifying experience, but still small compared to the trenches. In America's Second World War, the toll from strategic bombing soared into the hundreds of thousands. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Tokyo became infernos. Civilians were not bystanders anymore. They were targets, whether intended or not. So who dominated the skies more? Britain, whose fragile planes first proved that war could leap into the air, terrorizing soldiers and civilians alike? Or America, whose overwhelming fleets turned entire cities into firestorms, reshaping the very idea of what air war could mean? Perhaps the answer lies not only in the destruction, but in the psychology. Britain's biplanes brought fear because they were new and unknown terror. America's bombers brought fear because they were unstoppable, a known certainty. One was the fear of the future arriving too soon. The other was the fear of the future consuming everything in its path. But dominance is never only about fear. It is also about endurance, about who could keep fighting, who could survive beneath the shadows of the wings. And here lies the paradox. Britain endured the first terror, adapting, innovating, learning how to fight in 3 dimensions. America endured the burden of being the destroyer, carrying the moral weight of devastation as they fought to end the war. Both nations bore scars that went far beyond the battlefield. And so we are left with another question. Was dominance measured by who inflicted more fear, or by who bore more of it? Was it the British soldiers staring up in 1917, or the German civilians in 1944, who truly felt the weight of air power? The skies had become the arena where nations proved not only their power, but their willingness to use it. And in the next chapter, we turn to the ultimate question of dominance, the legacy each left behind. Britain, the pioneer who wrote the first rules of the air. America, the giant who rewrote them on a global scale. Which left the greater mark on history itself? Who really owns the sky? The one who first dares to conquer it, or the one who bends it completely to their will? Does true dominance belong to the pioneer who sketches the rules in blood and smoke, or to the industrial titan who later enforces those rules with overwhelming fire? To answer which army truly dominated the skies, Britain in the First World War or America in the Second, we must step back and look not only at the battles, but at what each left behind. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Britain's skies were forever changed. Out of the crucible of the Great War emerged the world's first independent air force, the Royal Air Force. No longer tethered to the Army or Navy, the RAF stood as proof that air power was no longer an accessory. It was a weapon in its own right. Britain had pioneered dogfighting, bombing, reconnaissance, and the very idea of command of the air. Their fragile biplanes had achieved something staggering. They had proven that wars could be decided not just on the ground, but above it. This was Britain's legacy. They wrote the first chapter of aerial warfare. They created the blueprint that every other nation, including America, would later follow. Without Britain's desperate experiments, without their aces carving tactics out of thin air, there would be no Mustangs, no flying fortresses, no Hiroshima. The courage of a few hundred British pilots gave birth to an entire philosophy of war. But while Britain drew the map, America redrew it in fire. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the skies had been utterly transformed. The United States had proven that air power could not just support wars, it could win them. Entire campaigns were shaped around the bombing of industries and cities. Entire nations crumbled under the relentless thunder of American fleets. And when the Enola Gay lifted off in August 1945, carrying the first atomic bomb, America delivered a final devastating truth. The skies were now the ultimate battlefield. One plane, one mission, could end a war. This was America's legacy. They demonstrated not just the potential of air power, but its supremacy. They moved the world from the era of knights and canvas wings to the era of superpowers armed with nuclear bombers. Their domination was not only of the battlefield, but of history itself. For in the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the ruins of Dresden and Tokyo, the entire world understood whoever controlled the skies controlled the future. Yet here lies the haunting question: which mattered more, Britain's fragile courage or America's overwhelming might? Without Britain's daring, there would have been no foundation. Without America's power, the war might never have ended as it did. One gave us the birth of air power, the other its terrifying maturity. Both changed the world, and we must not forget the human legacy. The British flyers of the First World War left behind myths of honor and sacrifice, tales of solitary duels in the dawn sky, remembered as legends of courage. The American crews of the Second World War left behind memories of endurance and teamwork, of formations stretching for miles, of battles not between individuals, but between machines, industries, and nations. Each story reflects a different kind of dominance, one of spirit, the other of scale. So who truly dominated? The answer is not simple. Britain dominated the skies of the Great War by daring to climb into them first, by proving that air power mattered. America dominated the skies of the Second World War by proving that air power could decide the fate of civilizations. One was the fragile beginning. The other was the overwhelming conclusion. And yet, both carry an echo that still shapes us today. Every jet fighter, every stealth bomber, every missile that arcs across our skies owes its lineage to those British pioneers and American giants. Every time a pilot straps in, every time a nation trembles at the roar above, it is because of what Britain began. And what America finished. Perhaps the truest answer is this: Britain lit the torch. America turned it into a firestorm. Together, they defined the age of air dominance. Without Britain, the skies would never have been a battlefield. Without America, the skies would never have been decisive. And so we return to the question we began with: who dominated the skies? The British pilots of World War I, fragile but fearless, or the American armadas of World War II, vast and unstoppable? The truth is both and neither. Britain showed the world how. America showed the world how far. But in the end, the skies belong to no nation. They belong to those willing to risk everything to rise into them, knowing they may never return. That is the true legacy of aerial war, not the machines, not the strategies, but the men and women who dared to climb into the heavens and change history forever. And as we look back at their courage, their sacrifice, their devastation, one question lingers still, unanswered, echoing in the silence after the engines fade, when the skies themselves become the battlefield. Who truly wins?